Okay, great. Is everyone ready to start the round? Okay. So with that being said, I will start time now. We affirm the resolve: the United States federal government should improve rural public health by expanding access to and availability of rural broadband services. So before I begin, allow me to provide a definition for rural broadband services. So essentially we tell you that this is high-speed internet specifically for these rural areas. Next, we tell you that the framework for today is going to be net benefit, as it is the fairest way to look at every round. And so moving on, our first contention is going to be telehealth. We tell you that in the status quo, people in rural areas have little to no access to actually good high-speed internet. Not only do they not have access to internet in general, but oftentimes it's very bad and it does not work greatly. So we tell you that these, in addition to this, these rural areas are also underserviced, right? They just have on balance fewer healthcare facilities, and these facilities are more likely to be much farther away from people, right? Because rural areas are much more spread out. These healthcare service places are much farther. The link here is that if we were to affirm the resolution, people wouldn't have to travel as far to actually get healthcare, i.e. like go all the way to the doctor, which could be miles and miles away. Rather, they can actually go onto the internet and have telehealthcare services and just have like better connection with a doctor, because now they actually have the ability to see a doctor more often and also just see a doctor in general, because many people in rural areas do not see a doctor because they do not have proper access because there are so little doctors available. The impact here is one on healthcare. We tell you that now they don't have to leave their home, or they do not have to travel like large distances, because now they can have like healthcare and checkups over the phone. And this is a much better option than essentially having no access to a doctor at all, because now you can call your doctor or have like a Zoom with them, and they can see how much they can help you through that. Secondly, we tell you that the impact is going to be mental health, because suicide rates are very high in rural areas, specifically because of like lower education when it comes to mental health and a number of other factors. And so we tell you that if we actually have access to telehealthcare, that means not only do they see a doctor so that they can see the signs more like soon, but also they can be better connected with a therapist and actually have like therapy accessible, because you can do it from your computer much better than if you were to have to go to a therapist office that's very far away or that might not exist at all. Our second contention is going to be doctors. The uniqueness here is that less people go into healthcare, specifically in these areas, because the office is very far, or just because the paychecks for that is actually very low, because these areas are so underfunded and because so few people actually go to these doctors' offices because they're so far away. And so the link here is that when we have access to broadband, then more people are actually going to want to become doctors, right? So the impacts are, when more people want to become doctors, then that means that these people can actually have like higher pay, because we have more people actually going to like doctors' offices because there's more available, because we have more doctors. And so this just leads into like a feedback loop, because people are getting higher wages because we have more doctors available, more people are going to offices. This means that more people are going to want to be doctors, and overall we just tell you that healthcare is going to become more accessible over time. Secondly, we tell you that more people are going to want to be doctors because it's a secure job now, because even if you don't live in a rural area, you can still be a doctor for that area over like telehealth. And so that's overall going to mean job security, more people becoming doctors. That overall is always going to help healthcare, because we have more people to provide more services for more people. Our third contention is research. Right now, in rural areas specifically, we have little polling or information on the people and their health like statistics in these areas, right? But the link here is that when we actually have telehealth services, this means that that doctors can monitor people better because they actually have connection to people, because people can actually talk to them and actually like get services from there. The impact here is going to be better healthcare policy, because when we have better polling and better information, this means that we're taking every person into account, right? Right now, we're kind of ignoring the rural population and what health problems might face them because we cannot get proper polling in these areas. However, if we can account for these people, we can actually see hidden problems, whatever those might be, right? Like river water might be toxic, or a certain chemical that people use on farms might be toxic. And so then we can work to actually combat all of these issues that people in these rural areas face because they're not being taken into account. Now we overall have better public health care for every single person, not just the people in these rural areas. Our fourth contention is going to be education. Right now, we tell you that when people have no internet access, they can't research something that might be happening to them, right? They can't research cold symptoms or symptoms of other diseases or other things like this. However, the link here is that if we're able to get internet, there's going to be like two things happening. First, people won't actually put off going to the doctor because they can see that they have symptoms of something, and then they're going to be checked out. Because right now, people don't go to the doctor because they think, oh, I'm fine. It's way too long of a journey, like I can't do it. But now when they have access to the internet, they can see what might actually be going on with them, and they can be boosted to go to the doctor more, which is always going to be better for public health. Secondly, we tell you that people are uninsured, right? Especially with like the healthcare systems that we have in the United States. So when we have people getting access to the internet, this means that they can actually like get at least some type of healthcare, even if that is just from Google. Something is always going to be better than not having any access to any healthcare information. So through this way, those people can be helped at least a little bit and know what to do about like something that's affecting them, whether it be like a cold or something else. And so the impact here is going to be overall increased public health, because we see more people going to the doctor and getting checked out, and two, more people getting at least some type of medical service. Even if that isn't from a doctor, they're still getting help with something that might be affecting them. Thus, I strongly urge affirmative ballot.
Okay, if everyone's ready, judges ready, opponents ready, I'll just jump right in. Okay, beginning my first word. Hello, judges. My name is Teddy Sickens. I'm the first and third speaker on the negation side of the resolution that the United States federal government should improve rural public health by expanding access to and availability of rural broadband services. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over my team's counterplan for this debate. Then I'm going to go over my opponent's framework and their contentions. And then finally, I'm going to get onto my own team's contention. First, we agree with their standard of net benefits with this debate on whoever provides the most benefit, whoever provides the most net benefits. For our counterplan is, rather than increasing rural broadband access, we propose passing legislation that expands the actual healthcare systems into these rural areas, as well as increasing incentives for physicians and other doctors living in rural communities. Expanding healthcare in this case includes, but isn't limited to, building more hospitals and ERs, constructing more offices for doctors, as well as, again, incentivizing doctors to practice in these areas through scholarships as well as grants. So, and our funding for this is normal ways and means, and our time frame would be as soon as possible. So going into their case, again, we agree with their definition of rural broadband services. We agree with net benefit. We agree with their standard of net benefits. I just want to point out they failed to provide a specific plan. They failed to provide how they would actually rural access to broadband services. They just said that they would. And this is important because, again, while they said that they would put in rural broadband access, they didn't say how they would do it. And since this is a policy debate, as implied by the word should in the resolution, which shows that we are taking an action here, they need to say how they would do something. Practicality is an issue here, as I will go on to talk about later in my speech. They didn't say where we would get the funding. They didn't say when we would do this. They never said how we would do this. If I'm misinterpreting my opponents, you can POC me right now. Sorry. Okay. So they just did not have a plan, which means that they did not lay out how they would actually put these policies into place, which therefore means that they didn't lay out how they would actually gain any of their benefits, how they would gain any of the arguments that they actually made. But diving into their argument specifically, they talked about how people are underserviced and don't have access because they are much further away. Our counterplan solves for this by providing closer access to healthcare. They talked about how people won't have to travel as far to get healthcare and that they can go onto the internet to see a doctor. Again, our counterplan solves for this, as they will still be able to see a doctor in a close proximity. And also they failed to provide for how they would put a better internet access into place, which again shows that they cannot provide for a way in which people actually gain better healthcare, because they don't have a method in which broadband access is going to increase. And because of this, we don't know how they are going to actually put this into place practically. They talked about their impact of mental health. Suicide rates very high in rural areas. There's less education. Access to telehealth care gives them access to education. Again, we're expanding healthcare in these areas. We're expanding programs. We're expanding other things that help people learn about mental health. And help people in healthcare. And so therefore our counterplan solves for this, but also they didn't really, again, their lack of plan fails to provide for anything that they're trying to do in this debate. They talked about more doctors. Again, we solve for less people going into healthcare because we provide for more incentives. We provide for an expansion of healthcare. Therefore, less people going into healthcare isn't an issue on the negation side of this debate. They talked about more doctors. Again, we solve for that. They talked about higher wages. Again, being a doctor and being a physician in our counterplan is still now a solid job, a stable job, as we are providing incentives. They talked about research, how we have little polling or research on health in these areas. Again, lack of a plan fails to actually provide for a method in which we would get more polling and research. Even if they expanded internet access, their lack of specificity makes it so we can't argue against this point. They talked about how education, how people can know what to do. It's the same, and how people are uninsured. It's the exact same thing as what I previously said. Their lack of a plan and lack of a method to actually put this into place, to explain how we would give this to them, how we would give this to rural communities, and how we would actually expand on it in broadband and expand and make it more accessible to the point where now people are able to do all of these things. And their lack of explanation for how we would get there simply makes it so it's unarguable from our side. So strike these points off the flow, especially because they cannot get up in their second speech and just say a plan, because again, I'm debating against it now, and that would just negate everything I'm saying. So now going into my team's contention. So starting off, we talked about how we're going to tell you that internet service providers lack an incentive, and it provides too much power to certain companies. So to make it profitable for internet service providers, they need to massively raise prices, which makes it unaffordable, which harms rural communities. They didn't have a plan. They didn't talk about how they would work with internet service providers to put this into place. So I'm going to tell you what would happen if we put these plans into place. So internet service providers are providing a service more socially beneficial than it is to a company's bottom line. They don't do this because, again, it's not profitable. And in a system where companies need to be profitable, they're not going to do this without profitability. What that means is that, practically speaking, internet service providers on their own are unlikely to invest in an expansion of fiber wiring in places where population density is low, and it is unlikely that internet service provider will receive enough of a return on infrastructure investment. They didn't provide how they would invest in infrastructure. They simply said, we're going to expand healthcare, we're going to expand broadband access, but that's not specific enough. As again, internet service providers simply lack an incentive to invest sufficiently in broadband infrastructure. And since they don't have a plan, we can assume that we would need to lean on internet service providers, which therefore means that they would need to raise prices in order to even make it have a semblance of profitability, which would just harm rural communities more because they can't afford these expensive prices. One of the main ways in which rural access to internet is limited is because when the government tries to expand it, it becomes complicated, and the government fails to provide for easy access, even if it is expanded. Again, they had a lack of a plan. So we don't know how they're going to make it more easily accessible or how they're going to make it more widely accessible. And what I'm telling you right now is that throughout the past 5 years, the government has tried to expand rural internet access and simply failed because the FCC has failed to sufficiently provide for sufficient mapping and sufficient put in sufficient methods of putting this into place. And because they failed to provide for a method in which they're going to magically put these systems in place, we can assume that these complicated systems that have failed in the past would simply be continued on and simply fail again. So according to researchers, broadband services have never been regulated, and essentially internet service providers can raise and lower prices whenever they want to by however much they want to. So moving on to rest of my team. So the impact of this really quickly is just that overall internet service providers would need to raise prices drastically to even provide for some profitability in rural areas, which means that rural communities would suffer even more as they simply cannot afford these price hikes. And also expansion would simply fail in the long run as the government has consistently tried and failed overall. My team's second contention is our counterplan increases accessibility. I've essentially gone over this in my refutations, and my second speaker will continue on. But essentially what this is arguing is that our counterplan increases accessibility to healthcare through providing more funding and through providing incentives for healthcare, and therefore makes it so people are able to access healthcare and therefore be more directly treated. So for these reasons and more, and because the affirmation has failed to provide how they would actually do this, please vote for the negation settings debate. Thank you.
Okay, so just an off-time roadmap. The order is just going to be the government case and then the opposition case. So if we're all good, then I can start time now. So let's start on this argument that the affirmative doesn't have a plan. Okay, a few responses. First of all, look to the fact that the counterplan that the opposition provides is just expand healthcare access and incentives for doctors. Like, what does this mean? Like, how are we expanding? Are we building more hospitals, or are they being paid more? Are there tax cuts for doctors? There's no real implementation here either. Second of all, we would argue that we are debating like a whole resolution act, which is saying, are we saying is expanding broadband internet access a good or bad idea? And furthermore, we would argue that that this doesn't inhibit them from responding to our case. Would it have been better if we were like, oh, it's wireless satellites, or it's wireless internet? Like, no, this isn't going to stop them to responding to their arguments. They're hiding behind this argument instead in a way to escape actually responding to the arguments we said. Furthermore, they could have asked the POI. They could have said, is there a plan for how you're going to implement this? They didn't do that. What that proves is that they're just trying to skew us out of the round and make us do a bunch of research about the specific implementation of broadband access, when instead we should be, I'll take this in just a second, when we should be debating the actual resolution instead of wasting time during prep for this. I'll take the POI.
Would you agree that the word should imply specific action?
No, I would disagree, and I would say that it actually implies, is it a good idea to do this or not? You should do this, you should not do this. Is it a good idea? Is it not a good idea? It does not imply that we need to spend time in our prep and research the specifics of broadband access and how the United States federal government is going to implement that. And again, I just want to reiterate the fact that they don't really make any responses to our case. They say two things. First of all, the counterplan solves, and second of all, we don't have a plan. Neither of these things actually respond to the key warrants. It doesn't matter if we had said we're going to use satellite or we're going to use wireless like internet access, the arguments still stand. Okay, allow me to extend the arguments real quickly. Our first advantage is telehealth. We tell you that right now people have little to no access to internet because they live farther away and because there are fewer healthcare facilities in rural areas. Increasing broadband internet access would allow for people to connect with their doctor online. We tell you this does two things. First of all, it increases just general healthcare because now people can go to their doctor easier because they don't have to leave their house. But second of all, it solves back for all the mental health concerns via access to therapy. It's really hard to go and drive a long ways to go get therapy. This will decrease these high suicide and depression rates that we see in rural areas. Our second advantage is about doctors. We tell you that it's really hard for people to go to healthcare because it's far away and because it's underfunded, which means that people in rural areas do not want to become doctors. Whereas we tell you that if we expand access to broadband internet access, that means that there will be more desirability to be a doctor, and there's going to be more healthcare access in rural areas. Furthermore, it will mean that you can go to the doctor from anywhere because they're online. Our third advantage is about research. Our argument is that we can increase polling and information that doctors have via broadband internet access, which means policies that the government can make can be more informed because now they can see like swaths of data, like, okay, this is maybe there's an environmental problem happening here. And then our advantage four is education. Our argument is that some people are uninsured, and so that means that they're not going to be able to like go and see their doctor. But if they have broadband internet access, they can go on to like, I don't know, WebMD or something like that, and they can figure out like what's wrong with them without having to have insurance. I want to make this argument that because they don't make any like actual arguments that attack the warrants of our contention, I don't think they should be able to be allowed to make new arguments in their next speech because they could have made them in the last speech instead of reiterating the same two things over and over again and have me respond to it now. It'd be unfair to allow them to do a line by line in their next speech and then we have 5 minutes to respond to like 12 minutes of line by line. Okay, now let's talk about the counter plan. Okay, first of all, it's not mutually exclusive in any way. Like you can still affirm the resolution and expand like access to healthcare and incentives for doctors. Second of all, we would argue that like if we look at like the price of implementation, like I don't understand expanding access to healthcare. Like I don't understand what exactly this means. But like we would argue like if it's like increasing like more hospitals or more funding to different facilities, we would argue that telehealth is actually more efficient in terms of price because like it'd be easier to just firstly expand access to like availability to see your doctor than it is to like fund them whatsoever. Third of all, we tell you the affirmative actually solves back for this without even needing the counter plan because we have more incentives for people to actually become doctors because they can treat people from anywhere. And because people will actually go and see the doctor more. And fourth, I want to reiterate, this is also super broad. There's no specific implementation of what expanding or what incentives actually mean. Okay, on their disadvantage about raising prices, a few responses. First of all, because the government is increasing availability and access, we can assume that they're not just going to, we can assume that like availability and access means that they're going to be able to actually use the internet, right? If we improve the availability and access for people to use internet, why would that mean that internet is inaccessible? Like those two things just don't line up. We also tell you that there's also no reason for these people to actually raise their prices. They make this like a general assumption. Internet providers are going to have price hikes to respond. Like there's no reason as to why. But second of all, we tell you that people actually will use the internet because there's like there's so many uses for it. First of all, and so when they expand the availability and access of the internet in rural areas, they wouldn't need to price hike because people would just buy internet, and now they have the ability to actually do that. Furthermore, if people use the internet, that means they will make a profit. Regardless of whether there's like other uses, people like having internet access. They just don't have that right now. Because right now, internet service providers are more worried about like urban areas because more people live there. But we say that if they provide them to rural areas, they would actually end up making a profit because people do want to buy internet. It's just not they're just not incentivized to do it right now because the government isn't making them. But in the affirmative world, like the United States federal government should the resolution, that's the United States as the actor, meaning that they are going to be forcing the availability and access. At the end of the day, I know what they're going to say in their next speech. They're going to say we don't have a plan, and so we can't buy any of our arguments because how are they even possible? But at the end of the day, they could have asked the POI and asked for the plan. Furthermore, this does not inhibit them to responding to the arguments. You can respond to all of the advantages that we said without knowing specifically whether we're using satellites or wireless access. Like none of these things are all of this argument they give you is just a wall to hide behind because they don't actually want to respond to what we're saying. We tell you instead that you should give less value to their arguments because they decided not to respond to unique warrants, and because they're trying to skew us out of the round. They wanted us to do a lot of specific research about broadband internet access instead of just actually debating the resolution. For all of those reasons, I strongly affirm.
Okay, 1 second. Let me get my timer ready. Three, two, one. Hello, my name is Carter Mitchell, and I am the second negation speaker for the resolution that the United States federal government should improve rural public health by expanding access to availability of rural broad services. So quickly, I'm just going to go over everything that their 2AC just said, and then I'm going to quickly go over our points and just kind of refute and counter-refute like everything that just went on. So the first thing they talked about was how we consistently brought up how the affirmative does not have a plan. And they said that we could have POI'd this, and they continue to say, oh, you could have POI'd this. And we're kind of trying to skew you out of the debate. They mentioned over and over again. This isn't true, Judge. Should implies that the word should directly implies that there is a specific action that needs to be taken. And this is widely accepted among the parliamentary debate community. And just because you didn't want to use your prep time to propose a plan, as most people would do when doing a parliamentary debate when the word should is implied, which, by the way, should directly means directly provides a specific action, doesn't mean that it's up to our duty to not POI you during that specific time. We were continuing to wait for a plan throughout your entire speech and not trying to interrupt you in POI. We were trying to wait for you to do out of a plan. And instead of that, you're directly skewing us out of the round by not having a plan, because we are not able to directly refute anything within your plan. Directly within your plan, which I'll get into later throughout my entire speech. They said that we do not have any implementation, that our counterplan doesn't specify anything. Judges, I would just like to quickly read over what we said in our counterplan. Rather than increasing rural broadband access, we propose passing legislation that expands the actual healthcare system into these rural access areas, as well as increasing incentives for physicians, as well as grants and other things for doctors, and increasing access for physicians, and increasing the ability to the wanting to be a doctor. This was increasing incentives for physicians living in rural communities, and expanding healthcare includes, but not limited to, building more hospitals, more ERs. We got funding in normal ways, and we had a So why this plan is mutually exclusive is because rural broadband access is really difficult. As really difficult as we propose in our first contention, and as opposed to us incentivizing as opposed to incentivizing being a doctor, basically saying that rural broadband access is really difficult as opposed to us incentivizing being a doctor, which is our plan, which is our counter plan. They can continue to go up here and say that they don't need to offer up a plan and that wasn't their duty, and instead should is whether it's a good thing or a bad thing or whatever they said. But and they said that we should focus more on their arguments, which I'll get into more, which my first speaker did talk about a lot, which was their arguments besides them lacking a plan. But again, should direct means that you must add a direct action or have a direct plan. And even with that, my first speaker did elaborate on a lot of the things they said and did have direct refutations into a lot of the things they said. And our direct refutations had a lot to do with our counter plan. Our direct refutation to their telehealth point had to do with the fact that while there is still telehealth, while there would be telehealth, there wouldn't be as many, we would be increasing the amount of doctors that would be nearby, meaning people would be able to have more doctors nearby, meaning people would be able to get the help that they need nearby. And what are they going to do if they need immediate help? What are these people going to do if they need immediate help if it's over telehealth? We could help them by increasing the amount of hospitals, which is directly put into our counter plans. With their contention too, which has to do with doctors, my first speaker directly said that we would be helping people, we would be enabling people to want to be doctors, because we would be incentivizing going into the medical field by all of the things that we put in our counter plan. Their third contention, which has to do with research, we would say that as my first speaker said, we would be continuing research through the amount of hospitals and the amount of funding that we would be putting into the medical care industry in this rural field. In return to their education point, my first speaker talked about, and with their lack of insurance point, is that the more doctors there are and the more education, the more funding that we're putting into this, into the medical care system, the more people would be able to have access to this care, which directly goes into all of the things that they were saying. And we prove to you why our counter plan solves for all of their contentions. So we're not just relying on the fact that they lack a plan. We're also providing to you that our counter plan provides that we would be able to solve for all of the warrants affirmative said, and also be able to tie into our counterplan. So even if we disregard everything that they should have done, which was they should have provided a plan, we can even look at the fact that our counterplan solves for all of their warrants, and we can look that we have knocked down not only the fact that they do not have a plan, but all of their warrants. They also pointed out how we cannot assume that like prices would go up, but what my first speaker explained is that since less people live in these rural areas, these kind of broadband services would need to rack up the prices so that they can keep up, meaning that they would need to raise their prices because there are less people living in rural communities, meaning that they would have to be more expensive. As in opposition, if you were living in an urban community with more amounts of people, the prices could be lower because there are more people for these internet service providers. Yes.
Isn't the U.S. federal government paying for the broadband service?
But actually, we don't really know. We don't know who's paying. We don't know the actor really, but we can even assume that we have to assume that it would have to do with by expanding access and availability to rural broadband system. It would be both the U.S. federal government and also these. And also, we have to assume that it would be that because we actually don't know because you don't provide for anything. But if it would be both because ISPs internet service providers still have to provide the service of internet itself. Sorry, just to clear that up, it would be both because internet service providers would still have to provide the service itself. Yes, the United States federal government could be funding it, but they don't have the service. They don't have the quote unquote internet service itself. They would have to still be provided a service through one of these broadband service providers. And with that, we don't really have like your exact funding or really like where the money is going to be coming from. And even if you want to say that just because we don't know the difference between the satellite or wireless or something like that, but they don't even specify like where the money is going to come from, how much money is like going to have like be given. They don't really specify anything, and they want to get us on specificity, but they don't really specify anything in their whole case. And we knocked down all of their warrants. We knocked down how our counterplan solves for all of their warrants, but they still lack a plan and they still lack anything that's kind of holding their plan up or holding up why they're providing a direct action, which overall is why I believe that you should vote for the negation side of this debate.
Okay, if everyone's ready, I'll just dive right in. 4-minute speech. Okay. Begin on my first word. Hello, judges. Again, hello, judges. You know who I am. I'm just going to dive right in. I'm going to start off with focusing on the policy stuff for most of the speech, and then I'm going to quickly go over some of the minutia of the arguments in this debate, and then finally I'm going to dive into I'm going to weigh this debate. So, starting off, the main thing in this debate is obviously the lack of plan on the affirmation side, and then they've tried to get us on our counter plan on our side. So, I'm going to first start off with their lack of plan. So, they said that we could have POI'd, we could have asked for a plan, and yet we didn't, and therefore we're trying to skew them out of the debate. Us not asking a POI isn't us trying to skew them out of the debate. It's just us doing nothing when they're failing to provide a plan that they had 20 minutes to write. We're not skewing them out of the debate. They're skewing themselves out of the debate by not providing something that's implied with the topic. Just because we didn't do something, it's not the negation's responsibility to make sure that the affirmation provides a plan. That is the affirmation's responsibility. And while they've tried to attack us for not making sure they had a plan, in no way is it unfair that we didn't make sure they had a plan, because in the end, debate is a competition, and just because we're not making sure they have a full case doesn't mean that we're trying to skew them out of the round. They didn't have a plan. That is not our fault, and just because they didn't say it doesn't mean it's our fault. They talked about and then in response to our CP, they talked about how the CP is not mutually exclusive. It is because we're not expanding rural broadband because that's increasingly difficult, as I provided in my first speech. But they talked about how it's not specific. It's very specific. The only non-specific part is where we said we would get the money from usual ways and means, which is something that we don't have the time to do in research. So, and we provided a time frame. We provided specific examples of how we would expand healthcare and how we would incentivize more doctors. So that point falls because our counterplan is specific in many ways, in many more ways than their plan. And overall, our counterplan still stands because it solves the problems that they've presented much more efficiently and in a much better way. And the only response they actually had was telehealth would be much more efficient in terms of price, which we don't actually know because, again, they didn't actually say a plan. So we don't know we don't know how expensive it would be to expand telehealth, and therefore we don't know how much money we're putting into it. So we have no proof that would be more expensive. So that point completely falls. But so just going on to their points, all of their points fall because they don't have a way to actually provide for them, because they don't say how they would actually be put in place. And when asking the question of whether or not the plan is important, a lack of a plan is important in this debate, they merely said it's about whether or not it's a good idea or not. One, it's a bad idea because of all of the problems I laid out in my first contention with the harms of expanding broadband in these areas, which they just dropped. So flow those through the end of this debate. And two, it's not actually about if it's a good or bad idea. It's about the practicality of it. It's about whether or not we should do this because it says should in the resolution. Ought would be about whether or not it's a good idea, whether or not in theory it's a good idea. Should means if we put this into place, would it be bad or good? And we have clearly proven that it would be a negative effect. It would have a negative effect. So quickly going over my team's points, we talked about how how internet service providers lack incentive because less people live in rural communities. Therefore, they have to raise the price. That therefore harms rural communities. We talked about how increasing access to healthcare in these communities more effectively helps them because it increases direct access, which helps them more. So just quickly weighing this debate, judges, the affirmation has clearly completely failed to provide a plan as to how they would actively do this. Well, the negation side has continuously provided you with warrants and reasoning about how increasing healthcare access directly overall helps people more, as we are able to directly help them, as we are able to solve all of the problems the affirmation presents and doing it with specificity, as well as simply being more efficient overall, as they have failed to prove how they would do anything. And we have given you the problems with their plan, and we have given you, with their lack of plan, we have given you all of this, and we have given you warrants and benefits from our counterplan. So please vote for the negation side of this debate. Thank you.
Okay, quick off-time roadmap. I'll be going over the whole plan thing as quickly as I can, CP, and then I'll get into actual voters and weighing. So if everyone is good, I will start time now. They say that the word should means that action should be taken. However, we tell you that the definition of should by Oxford Languages is used to indicate obligation, duty, or correctness. Nowhere in there does it say we need to take an action. That is just something they made up. But even if you buy this, when the affirmative does not specifically say a plan, does not say it word for word, you assume the resolution is the plan because everything that's needed to know is within the resolution, right? Any normal debater would go in and assume that the resolution is the plan because we tell you the USFG is what's doing it, and overall we tell you that this is going to be the plan. When we spend time debating about whether or not we need a plan or not, we're taking away from the actual education of debate, and it just makes it so much worse. Not only this, but they said that ought is different. However, ought is the exact same thing as should, meaning that they literally just bypass all of this and try to just skew us out of the round by using this. They say that we skew them out of the round because we're not giving them anything to respond to. They can very well respond to our contentions, even if we don't say that we're going to use a satellite or whatever it might be. That is just simply untrue. Not only that, but nowhere in the NPDL rules does it say that the affirmative needs to provide a plan. That is not a thing. You just assume that the resolution is the plan. But let's move on to their counterplan, which seems to not be mutually exclusive. exclusive, and which seems to not be something they respond to. They talk about how it's mutually exclusive because they're not expanding broadband internet service, but that does not stop the affirmative world from being able to implement both broadband and their counterplan. This is not mutually exclusive. Permit in every way possible. This does not stand in any, just like looking at this counterplan, even if you buy it, you're going to be voting for the affirmative because we can use that counterplan in the affirmative world. But let's move on to the affirmative arguments. Essentially, you can just flow all of these through because they make zero responses on any of them because they're too busy debating on whether or not we need a plan. First, we talk about telehealth and now about when we have like actual internet access, people can actually have access to not only doctors, but therapists, and people can overall get more healthcare access than they're already getting. Our second contention is doctors, and we talk about how we're going to have more people going into healthcare because now we have more access to it. More people can like zoom in to do healthcare, meaning there's always a secure job. And secondly, we tell you more people want to become a doctor because they can get higher wages being a rural doctor in that area, meaning when they get higher wages, it creates a positive feedback loop of more people wanting to become doctors. Our third contention is research. We talk about how there's little polling in these areas. However, if we were to have polling, we could actually make better policy that takes every single person into account. Fourthly, we tell you education and how there's no internet access. Basically, these people put off going to the doctor. And most importantly, we tell you that uninsured people actually have a chance of getting at least some type of healthcare through like Google or whatever other means. That's something that their counterplan doesn't solve for, but we still perm their counterplan, which they do not actually respond to. On their contentions, they essentially say that there's a lack of incentive and they don't know who the actor is. It's going to take a lot of money, but the actor is the USFG, right? They're the ones providing this service and accessibility, meaning they're going to be paying for it. So none of this still stands. But even if you buy some of it, we tell you that we're always going to outweigh on probability because they might increase prices, but we tell you 100% these people are going to have more access to healthcare. And that is the most important thing because healthcare is always going to matter more than money because death is involved. So we tell you in every way, shape, or form, we outweigh because not only do we have contentions that go completely unresponded to, but we tell you that we're increasing not only mental health access, overall healthcare access, which is always going to be better for these people in these rural areas. Insofar as we tell you that, or they also on this point about like their counterplan, they say by normal means, right? What does this mean? How much funding? Like literally, they are also broad. They're literally just being hypocritical throughout this entire debate, right? They say normal means. That's what you assume the affirmative is doing. And through these normal means, we actually have no idea where this funding is going. But we also outweigh on probability on this point because we tell you that the price of providing telehealth care is going to be always less than building more hospitals, giving grants, loans, whatever it might be, where telehealth care is always going to be cheaper, and that's why it's going to be the solution that we can do first, even if you buy the counter plan, because that way we can get these people healthcare access immediately rather than waiting for people to go to college, get their degree, go through medical school, then become doctors, waiting years for a hospital to be built. We tell you that within an instant, we give these people actual access to healthcare that they do not have now. Not only do we outweigh on time frame, we outweigh on probability, and we also outweigh on magnitude because we're providing healthcare service, and that is always going to outweigh this lack of incentive of prices and things like that. Thus, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot.
All right, great debate, everyone. This was very, very fun to watch. I think a great debate, and yeah, where judges will come to a decision, then we'll come back to give the RFD.
Thanks so much, judges. Great round, guys.
Thank you. Good round.
All right, hi everyone. We're ready to announce the decision. If you could turn on your camera to let us know that you're here. All right, I'm always the second panelist to fill out my ballot. I'm very sorry for delaying y'all, but I can announce that it was a 2-0 decision for the Gov team. This is Ridge. I can start first since I'm unmuted, and then I'll hand it to Hunter to give his RFD. I think basically what happens in this round is that the counter plan is presented entirely non-uniquely from the government case. I think like at a very beginning part of the debate, I already see that like both teams are trying to access the same impacts of like increased healthcare, things like that. If both of you guys are trying to access the same impact, it's really important at that point to tell me why your mechanism specifically is better, not that it also solves, right? Which is the only thing that I'm kind of hearing. Like, we also solve for this issue, we also solve. I'm like, yeah, I get it, but like, why specifically should we prefer your plan or your counter plan over like what the government wants to do? I think like the only areas of uniqueness that I really see on either side is like from op. I hear that the CP solves more efficiently and better, but I don't actually think I receive sufficient warranting on like how it is more efficient or how it is better. Apart from like the one idea of like maybe in emergencies, it's better for you to see an actual doctor, but I don't think that's like weighed against anything else in the round. From Gov, I think the insurance, I think there is a lot of weighing done in that last speech, which is pretty good. Like talking about time frame on like how it's going to take a lot of time to necessarily build like hospitals and also to find people to staff these hospitals, whereas like implementing broadband grids and things like that is probably going to be a little faster. I think also the insurance argument never gets refuted, and I actually quite like that argument a lot, talking about how a lot of rural Americans uniquely don't have insurance. And like, that's not going to be solved with something like a hospital, right? That can really only be solved by like giving them access to other forms of education like WebMD or like anything on the internet. So I think those were the two things that were unique that pushed Gov over the edge. But I think both teams really could have made a more persuasive case for themselves by delineating very clearly, like if we are going to access the same impacts, like be charitable to your opponents, right? Let's assume in everyone's best case, we're going to access the same impacts. Why is ours still a better path to the ballot? I think that's what should have been done. But Hunter, go ahead.
Yeah, so pretty much everything that Eliz said, I would also agree with. I would say, okay, the team that spent the less amount of time talking about the plan and the policy was the team that I ultimately sided with, because it became really difficult. What I mean by this is I buy a lot of what government says when opposition comes up and says basically that Gov should be like disqualified from this round, right? It's like a priority. And then unfortunately, like there's issues with the counter plan that basically turn these into a wash. So if I buy that the plan is incomplete, I'm also, because it like doesn't have spending, I'm also going to buy that the counter plan is incomplete because the spending was normal ways and means. If I buy that the plan is like, vague, I'm also going to buy that the other plan was somewhat vague. So it was really like, I think that was pretty much a wash and like wasted material. And so instead, yeah, I defaulted to really like what team is weighing better, where the uniqueness comes from. And I thought that really shined in the final two conclusion speeches, where like what I get from government is here's all of the unique things that we provide. And even if you agree that the price increases, we would rather have a more efficient healthcare system that we're able to do. And I think that weighing is really what allowed Gov to take this ballot for me. And for opposition, I would just recommend, I think you did have really good arguments. I would recommend talking a lot more about them. Like, I think there was too much time spent on the idea of fairness. And especially, I think more pressingly was the idea of mutual exclusivity, because that was like something that immediately when I heard the counter plan is, how is that going to be differentiated? Because if it isn't, that is something that like as a judge, I will strike out, different than like a Gov who, yes, government team, you probably should have a more comprehensive case. But I think we could all as debaters assume the actor is going to be the federal government, right? The money is going to be more than the means. It's just going to be like very generic stuff. So I think while that's held against them, it's not enough as something to disqualify them. And since all of those eggs were kind of in the same basket, it made it hard to vote for opposition.
If there are any questions that you guys have, feel free to ask. But I have a couple of points of feedback that I want to give on things that both teams could have said in order to make the debate a little bit better. I'll start off, sorry if there's some noise in the background, I apologize. So I think one of the things that I like think could have been developed a lot better is this idea on op that like the prices are going to go up necessarily for rural areas. I don't think this is warranted very well in the debate, because you're just saying like, oh, broadband services need to raise prices because there are fewer people living in communities. I think an intuitive piece of rebuttal is like, well, aren't they giving out less units? Like they can still charge the same price per unit and thus they don't need to raise prices. I think if you gave the example of like, look, like the way that internet specifically works is you kind of need to set up a whole grid in order for everyone to be able to communicate with each other, right? In an urban area, this is fantastic because per like, I don't know, kilometer squared of like space, you have like maybe 100 times the people, at least like dozens times the people that would have been living in rural areas. So it's a lot more price effective. That's why it costs so much, because they still have to cover very similar amounts of area, maybe even more in rural areas, but there are so few people paying for it. That's why it's like, it's been so difficult. I need like that level of analysis for you to really tell me and for me to be convinced, oh, this is going to be more expensive for the people. I think, again, very easily on Gov on that side, as Hunter said, I don't expect you to have necessarily a full plan, but I think it is pretty much implied in the motion that like maybe the government would subsidize this kind of cost. And I think that could have been brought up at least once during the round. The other thing that happened was because there is a little bit of exclusivity on the op when they talk about like, hey, at least we have like a hospital in order for people to go to if in case they need it. I think like one of the really unique benefits of telehealth and like accessing or like getting checkups more frequently is like preventative care. So a lot of people in rural areas, because they're putting off going to the doctor for so long, by the time they actually have to go, it's like literally an emergency. Whereas you can say like, if you're having more frequent checkups and things like that, your doctor can say, hey, it looks like things are about to take a turn for the worse. How about before that happens, let's like make some lifestyle adjustments. And then that means that like these people don't have to get into these potentially fatal situations, right? So I think both teams are getting into places that are really great in terms of argumentation, but you do need more analysis on like what specifically happens, who is affected, what are their incentives, how might those incentives like play out in the real world? And I think that will make the quality of debate a lot better.
Yes, I would also add one piece of feedback to specifically the government side. Oh, I guess this could just really apply to anybody, but make sure you there are times when you want to make sure you have a little bit of humility when you're saying something, because sometimes I know debaters want to be confident, but people will go up there and they'll say something, and as a judge, if I know that it's very, very wrong, it could actually be held against you. So what I mean is, if you come up here and you say that like there's no difference between like should and ought, I don't think any judge most of the judges aren't going to buy that. Like it's generally well known that should is a policy and ought is like a moral obligation. And while you don't need necessarily a comprehensive plan, like to say that in the debate round, when you could have just like either said nothing or said like I'm not sure of the rules rather than like asserted it as a fact, I would just like that would be something to caution debaters on, is making sure if you're not entirely sure on the rules, don't like state something as a fact, because if as a judge we have alternative evidence of this, then it might be like held against you when we're actually figuring out a reasoning. But yeah, great debate. If anyone has any questions, I think we finished this pretty early, so like I'm fine with staying around for a few seconds.
Gov doesn't have any questions.
Yeah, I don't think Neg does either. Thank you guys so much. Great round, guys.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Great round. Good luck on your next one.
Goodbye, Liz. Goodbye, Joel.
Bye, Hunter. Bye, Joel.